having Steve Schwartz. Some of you may have already met Steve. He's got a very popular LSAT channel and blog and all over social media. So I'm not an LSAT expert, so I decided, along with Steve, to chat and learn a little bit more about the LSAT, kind of see what's happening. My LSAT experience goes back 30 years to when I took it. So with that, Steve, why don't you just jump in, tell me a little bit about yourself and let my audience know what you do, and let's begin.
Of course, Beau. Thanks so much for having me on. It's great to connect with you and collaborate again. Remember, we talked quite a while back, and whenever I'm talking with people about YouTube, they're always saying, oh, I watch Professor Baez's channel all the time. You got quite the channel yourself. So I'm glad we're having this meeting of the minds here. For folks who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I also have a popular online LSAT course where we meet over Zoom, and I'm just here to share any advice and insights I can around LSAT prep, law school admissions, and the upcoming LSAT changes.
Awesome. Well, Steve, some of the people that are jumping in today, they're just starting their journey. They're exploring. They've heard there's this thing called the LSAT. So why don't you tell us just, in a brief few words, how much ever time you need, talk to us. What is the LSAT and for kind of the novice?
Yeah, sure. So the LSAT is the law school admission test. It's a standardized multiple choice exam required for law school admissions. And it has three different sections on it, three different types of questions. You have logic games, which are short puzzles where you're manipulating logical variables logically, making deductions, making inferences. You also have logical reasoning, which are short bite-sized arguments you're required to analyze. And then you have reading comprehension, which is longer passages where you're answering questions about the structure of the arguments contained in those passages. It's a very strictly timed exam, causing lots of anxiety, but it can be mastered in the end.
Awesome. So it's something you can master. So what kind of mindset do you need before preparing for the LSAT?
Well, the LSAT requires a critical and skeptical mindset where you're not taking things at face value. A lot of times on the LSAT, people will encounter one of those logical reasoning arguments, and they say, oh, sounds good to me. But then you see it that they're asking you, what's the flaw in the argument? So of course, they're telling you, hey, you might have missed something. And so you have to go in with a certain degree of skepticism saying, hey, given this evidence, can we infer this conclusion? If not, what's missing? What's the gap? And that's really my job as an LSAT teacher, is to help students go in skeptical at the start, looking to spot the disconnects.
All right. Now, one question I get all the time on my YouTube channel, because again, I get newbies and people are thinking about law school, and they say, when should I start? I mean, I'm getting kids now that are 15 years old. They're not even in high school. Should I start preparing now? So what's your recommendation as far as a timeline?
15 is definitely too early. Enjoy high school, enjoy college, take a gap year if it makes sense for you. And when you're looking to get into the LSAT, I would say typically it's going to be, if you're still in college, maybe your junior year, maybe your senior year, or maybe you've been working for a while, and that's fine. You don't have to go directly. I would allow a minimum of 3 months to study for the LSAT, ideally 5 to 6 months to achieve your fullest potential. So just study for it whenever you have the time.
All right. Excellent. So what about just picking up like an LSAT prep book in your freshman year, just to start thinking about it? Do you think there's much value there, or are you're saying just a year out's about the most you need to sort of get to the top of your game?
A year out's probably the most you need. It took me an entire year, but a lot of that was wasted time studying inefficiently. I could have done it in half the time if I studied properly. But freshman year, listen, it's not going to hurt you to do a little bit here and there, but also enjoy college and keep your GPA up. GPA is important as well. LSAT's more important, but I wouldn't want anyone to start too early and get burnt out or burn through valuable practice material studying inefficiently. So I'd say do a little bit if you want, just to get your feet wet and get some early exposure, but I would kick it into high gear a lot closer to the test date.
Okay, excellent. Now, once they start getting into LSAT prep mode, what are sort of the common mistakes you've seen people make?
Biggest one is just taking exam after exam and measuring your results and hoping something will change. That's how I went about it at first. You have all these numbered LSAT exams. They start with number 1, going up to exam 89, and there's even more beyond that. And so people just kind of get into this habit where, okay, I'll start with the oldest, work my way up, doing exam after exam, tracking their scores. But the thing is that you're not building the foundation first. You want to learn the basics of each of those sections: logic games, logical reasoning, reading comprehension, then take individual timed sections because the timing is really important. Then work on your endurance with full length exams. But there's a process. You have to build your scaffolding, build those layers, starting with the foundation, not just jumping into exams.
All right. Now, another question I get all the time, and I'm curious as well. So can the LSAT be learned, or is it more like an IQ test where, look, I'm kind of a 155 kind of person, and I'm just not going to deviate, plus or minus beyond a few points beyond a certain score?
It's definitely learnable. It is not an IQ test. A lot of times people get wrapped up in that idea, which I get because it makes you feel dumb to get stuff wrong, especially if you see this flawed argument and you thought it sounded good to you. Turns out it's not. But it's really about cultivating that skeptical mindset. I mean, personally, I started around a 152. I ended up with a 175. It took me an entire year, but I didn't get 23 points smarter in just 1 year. It's really that I just cultivated that skeptical mindset and I learned what the test makers were looking for. So it's really just a test of how well did you study for it? How well did you cultivate that mindset that you can carry forward into law school and beyond, where you could take a general principle and apply it to a particular situation? But it is not your intelligence. It is not your self-worth. It's just how much time did you put in and did you study the right way?
All right. Now, I think we live in a new world post-COVID, and I don't know if this happened because of COVID or was already happening beforehand, but my understanding is that the LSAT has moved online. Can you tell me a little bit about why it moved online and where we are in an online world?
Yeah, sure. So the LSAT was a paper and pencil exam. They started administering it on a tablet before the pandemic hit. And then once the pandemic hit, they couldn't have people coming to test centers taking it on tablets in person. So they moved it online. They moved it online in May 2020, pretty quickly, only 2 months into the pandemic, at least in the US. So it was online for about a year and a half. Now, starting August 2021, they've moved it to a new online format. They had removed the unscored experimental section temporarily because they had to figure out how to make it online with a certain duration, but they also need to be able to test out future LSAT questions. And so they've added back in that unscored experimental section. And so that's how they kind of calibrate the difficulty level of the exam going forward. So it's online, at home, on your own computer.
Now you're talking about online. My understanding is there are two different sort of online formats, the LSAT Online and the LSAT Flex. What's the difference and what are these two things?
Right. So the LSAT Flex was the initial online format with only 3 scored sections. That's it. But because they have to be able to test out future questions and calibrate the difficulty, they are adding in that unscored experimental section starting in August. And that exam format is simply called the LSAT to distinguish it from the temporary Flex format.
Excellent. Now, in the past, this was always a challenge with the LSAT. You had people in foreign countries that wanted to take the LSAT. Is the LSAT, the online version, available around the world? I mean, could I be in India or Pakistan and take the LSAT online?
Yeah, you can. It's available everywhere. So there's no more going to in-person test centers, and people would travel from one country to another or one region to another because it wasn't offered in their location, only the major cities. But now that it's online, you could take it anywhere.
And are they doing it at one time? Like everybody has to take it at, say, 8 a.m. Eastern time, or does it take into account local variations?
Yeah, so luckily they do take into account local variations. They're not making you wake up at 3 a.m. if you're located outside the typical regions. So you can choose your own testing time. It's typically available 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern time, but they make it work for you if you're in other locations.
And are they giving the same test, or they move to a model where you get the same difficulty of questions, but the questions are all different?
Same difficulty, different questions. They mix it up. So it's not like if you take it at 8 a.m., you then can tell the person taking it at 4 p.m. what the questions were. They mix it up, and it's actually administered over the course of a week for each testing period. So some people take it Saturday, some people take it Tuesday, and they could be totally different exam questions.
Excellent. But they have to do it within a block of time. They can't take, like I know with the CPA exam, you can take different portions over time.
No, it's all got to be on one day for you. So if you're taking it on Saturday, you're taking it over the span of a couple hours.
Okay, excellent. So do you recommend that applicants take the online LSAT or wait for it to come back in an in-person format?
I'd recommend online. We don't know if ever they're going, when, if ever they're going to offer it in person again. They've indicated they would like to be able to offer people the option to take it in person if for some reason online doesn't work for them. But logistically, it's so much easier for them to offer it online that I personally don't see them going back on that. They've got a good operation going with offering it online. They have a good partner with ProctorU to make it as smooth as possible. It's certainly not perfect, but in person is not perfect either for different reasons. So I'd say if you're going to law school soon, you want to get the LSAT out of the way, just take it and get it over with.
Now, you mentioned the experimental section. Now, as a test taker, will I know which version is experimental, which isn't? I mean, do they disclose that?
They don't tell you during. Afterwards, people will talk online on forums a little bit and kind of figure it out, but you can't tell during. They make it indistinguishable from the scored portions because they want you to give your full effort to help them for their testing purposes. And although the difficulty might be a little bit off within an experimental section, it's so subtle that hardly anybody would ever be able to tell, myself included. And due to the stress and the time constraint of the test day experience, I wouldn't waste time trying to figure that out and risk bombing a section that actually counted. I'd give it every section your full effort.
Sure, no, that makes sense. Now, how much time per section and how much time overall to take the exam?
So each individual section is 35 minutes under standard test taking conditions. You can apply for extra time if you have test anxiety or other reasons to get accommodations, in which case they might give you time and a half or double time. But most people are doing 35 minutes, and it's now 4 sections per exam. So that's roughly, 2.5 hours or so. You've also got a 10-minute break between sections 2 and 3. So you're looking at about 2.5 hours, 2 hours, 45 minutes for one standard test day experience.
Wow. So 2.5 hours is going to depend on whether you get scholarships, what law school you can go to. And my understanding is, this is going to the law school admissions side. So let's say you bomb it, you have test anxiety, you take it, you get a much better score. Do you know how law schools are dealing with multiple scores?
Yeah, they take the highest score. They don't penalize you for retaking. So they're not averaging multiple, they're taking the highest. And so if you bomb it, it's not a huge deal. You can retake, and that's what they'll consider.
Excellent. Now, looking at the educational news, right? We've seen a lot of changes over the last year as undergraduate institutions are going with SAT optional. They're not requiring standardized tests. Do you see any trends in legal education, or are they heading in that direction, or do you think the LSAT is here to stay, or some other standardized test?
Well, the American Bar Association requires that law schools use a valid and reliable admission test. So they're required to use something. As to whether that's the LSAT in particular, it certainly doesn't have to be. There are some schools starting to take the GRE as well. But the LSAT is still the best way to indicate to law schools that you're serious about law in particular. You're not applying just on a whim. And they want a standard way to evaluate applicants, whereas GPAs can vary based on your major or based on the institution. Grade inflation's a thing, right? So the LSAT is a way that they can standardize how they look at people.
Something, because I have been reading in the press, the GRE is maybe 10, 15% of the law schools out there are now allowing the GRE as an alternative. Do you know what the schools are doing with somebody who has a great GRE score, but maybe not as great of an LSAT score, how they're treating someone? Are they ignoring the GRE when there's an LSAT? Any idea of what's happening?
In that particular circumstance, I would expect them to ignore the GRE and look at the LSAT. And part of the reason for that is that if you have an LSAT score on record, that's going to the American Bar Association. That's getting factored into the US News rankings. So if someone had a great GRE score and took it first, I'd say maybe you want to apply with that and see what happens. But if you took the LSAT and got a low score, that's going to get factored into how that impacts their rankings. And so it wouldn't be to your advantage to apply with that lower score unless you could follow it up with a higher LSAT.
And any idea yet if the U.S. News is taking into account GRE scores, or is it still just sort of a backwater and being ignored for now by U.S. News?
To my knowledge, it's more of a backwater thing. And I heard from UCLA law admissions that fewer than 5% of applicants at their institution are accepted with the GRE. So the LSAT's still the main game in town.
Okay, that's good to know. And one last question: what are kind of your top tips for people taking the LSAT remotely?
Make sure you have a good internet connection. If you don't, LSAC will give you a credit to take the LSAT at a hotel or an Airbnb, and you could go there and make sure you have a solid internet. That's really one of the biggest things. Make sure that your friends and family are going to give you some peace and quiet during the test day sitting. And I would say get used to taking the LSAT online as well. LSAC has this system set up where you could take the exam, your practice tests, just like the real thing. So don't study out of books. Don't take your practice tests in books when the LSAT's online. Get used to the look and feel of the test day experience, the countdown timer, the highlighting and underlining tools, so that you're best set up for success on the actual day.
Awesome. Well, Steve, those were all the questions I had for you. I want to thank you for coming on and talking to my audience again. What I'm going to do is leave a link in the description below to Steve's course. I mean, how many years have you been doing this? It's been a long time. I mean,
yeah, I've been doing this since 2005. So it's been quite a journey over the years, from paper and pencil to tablet to LSAT Flex to the new format. But I love it. This is what I do, and I'm obsessed with it. So I'll keep releasing more videos, keep teaching more classes, and invite folks to check out the course.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Pleasure chatting with you as usual, and we'll talk again sometime. Take care.
Thanks, Beau.
Well, thanks, Steve. I learned a few new things myself, so that's always it's good as well.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.